Chapter 3, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 2, On Death's Ground, Part 1, Imperial Lines, Pavonian Heartlands. Kronus was for a tough time even in the best-case scenario. If we lost, everyone would be dead if we were lucky, otherwise we just might become the playthings of demons and Xeno alike. And when we win, as I had to continue repeating to myself and anyone willing to listen, then everyone still alive on Kronus would be on short rations for the foreseeable future. That one was inevitable. About half the Imperial Guard and most of the loyal PDF units were deployed straight in the middle of the continent, if not the planet's breadbasket, and very soon we would turn it into a death field. Outside the Colonel's CP, priests screamed prayers to him on terror, as if their sheer volume would make him hear and respond. Commissars marched up and down the ranks, shouting encouragements and threats. They did their best to instill more fear in the troops of themselves and me than the green tide fast approaching us. Scouts have firm lock on the first wave. It's a disorganized mob, primary melee troops with mixed shooters and the odd AT, an aide reported. A tech priest wearing rusty red robe that concealed almost his, or hers, whole body shifted in the far corner of the CP. Mecha tendrils waved in a silent rhythm. Red light shone from the hood, hiding the Martian's face, or what they had replaced it with, and the picture on the hololith in the center of the room shifted. Keep the artillery silent and concealed. Heavy weapon teams are clear to begin mortar bombardment to soften up the horde once the enemy enters effective range. Unless we're in danger to be overrun, kill teams are to hang back. We're likely to get only one chance of this unless the Emperor smiles upon us and the fleet boys and girls manage to fry us a war boss, Colonel Barnabas instructed. His cleanly shaven head almost reflected the light of the tactical consoles. Instead, his midnight black skin tone, just this side of being unnatural, practically absorbed the light. 2 rolls of silver metal teeth flashed in a crooked grin. The greenies want a scarp. Let's give them one they will never forget. Besides a 3-dimensional map of the area of operations, now the hololith displayed 3 windows, feeds from servo skulls attached to the forward observers and scout elements. As far as the horizon stretched, all that could be seen were massed ranks of jogging orcs. Most of them were rather huge, green, naturally, but ugly, had tusks that would make the largest of boars feel inadequate, and every single one of them brandished some kind of weapon, often 2 or more. Crude axes and swords were a given, along with armor that was practically whatever piece of scrap they get their grabby hands on. Some of them wielded even cruder firearms that by no means should be able to fire, yet in orc hands were still dangerous. Much smaller figures darted between the legs of the larger specimens. They were even uglier if that was possible. Tiny, gnarled parodies of children that ran in every which way, only to be often trampled or even grabbed for a hungry orc to take a bite of the screaming creatures before throwing the rest away. Dark, choking smoke formed clouds far behind the visible horde, the enemy vehicle formations, if the expected mob of scrap that somehow moved warranted such a lofty title. Designated marksmen, greet our guests. The rest of the regiment, hold fire until the orcs come closer, Barnabas added. Only now did he turn to address me. Inquisitor, it's an honor you chose to fight beside us today. What are your orders? Barely visible spears of coherent light lanced from our positions, and the few enthusiasts running in front of the advancing mobs soon staggered. Smaller pieces of scrap armor outright vaporized, and chunk of green flesh blew off when green skin burned and blood boiled. Wounds that would have incapacitated the average human, if not proven outright fatal, merely slowed down the sprinting orcs. Better marksmen didn't bother with body shots and aimed at the heads. Jaws exploded in shower of superheated bone, eyeballs vaporized and faces melted. The joyous roars finally turned into howls of rage and pain. Finally, orcs began to fall. We'll wait for an opening. I nodded at the librarian who did his best to lean on a power maul while clad in all the bells and whistles that a blood raven of his status could scrap together. Atheus was doing his best to look positively friendly and non-threatening without resorting to warp shenanigans. Needless to say, his effort left something to be desired if the way everyone but the colonel stiffened when we entered the CP. Give us one and we'll do everything humanly possible, and then some, to bag us a war boss. That's the spirit, Inquisitor. Barnabas's rich baritone echoed around the metal walls of the CP. Orcs entering effective range. It looks like the rest are as eager to get shot as those enthusiasts. The horde surged forward, and even in the CP, we could hear the distinct thumps of mortars. He and Promethean warheads rained fire and steel just behind the first lines of the huge mob, effectively slicing the advancing horde into smaller, easier-to-digest chunks. If anything, the bombardment only made the orcs more eager to get to us. Wah! Distant cries echoed above the plain. We might not be able to detect Eldar craft before they begin bombing us, I warned. We've deployed the heavy AA assets covering our artillery and logistics. The light and medium AA is what we have to cover the rest. The colonel gave a small shrug. It wasn't like we could call in more assets. The Aeronautica is out in force as well. Orc mobs moving in all across the line, a Vox operator reported. On the hololith we saw and moments later heard autocannons and all other kinds of support weapons let loose. Multi-lasers, heavy stubbers favored by the local PDF as squad support weapons, even a few lance cannons that let loose in a less powerful anti-personnel mode. They sacrificed direct firepower for a weaker, continuous beam that experienced teams used to reap a frightful harvest from the approaching enemy. Soon massed ranks of guardsmen, concealed in reinforced bunkers if they were lucky, or relying on mere trenches, sandbags and kilometers upon kilometers of barbed wire if not, began shooting volleys of laser death. The first ranks of the horde simply vanished, devoured by the firepower arrayed against them. The rest of the nearly mindless brutes only intensified their joyful cries and pushed forward. "Mortars, switch," Barnabas ordered. For a few heartbeats, the shriek of falling rounds ceased before the mortar teams fixed the next pre-targeted line and opened fire again, thus serving the next chunk of the horde for our front line. And so it begins. Part 2. Orc Horde, Pavonian Heartlands. Engines roared, mech boys screamed and laughed at each other, knobs and mega-armored knobs drummed wicked claws into plates of solid metal chanting. Above all else, countless orcs chanted their joy as one. Wah! Warboss Gorguts Ed Hunter grinned toothily from his perch, on top of a huge contraption built by his mech boys. All around him, as far as he could see, vehicles of all stripes drove more or less in the same direction, to battle, from boys on kitted-up bikes, with skulls from those weak Hummies they didn't have fun with over the past few days, to looted tanks and even some built by the mech boys when they got bored. Life was good. Her was surrounded by more boys than he had earned teeth so far. From what he could hear, the Hummies finally decided to bring on those with fight in them. There were even those weird blueskins to fight. It was going to be glorious. At least that was what Gorguts kept telling himself. Over the past couple of days, he couldn't help but feel a damn itch in the back of his skull, and tonight, once the sun set, as his horde moved past those mountains to the right, they all saw pretty green lighting. That was a propar color, not like those dumb blue boys. The warboss shook his head after it by instinct, turned to look in the direction of those mountains. Even now, with the sun rising and falling upon his advancing boys, he could see forks of deep green color, darker than the skin of most orcs. That picture unsettled something deep in him. His whole body itched for a fight, and Gorguts hoped by Morg that the Hummies would provide. Then, once the War swept them away, he could turn the whole horde against that. The warboss blinked as he lost his thought. The itch, the pressure for battle, it grew with every passing moment. It was a drive like he had never experienced before. It was glorious. Wah! Gorguts waved his mega-claw. Faster! Blood axes! Faster, damn you! He needed to fight now. We're red! We're fast! The mech boy driver roared back. Whatever the fume-drunk little runt did, the giant truck, which was naturally painted bright red, kicked into gear and accelerated. Wah! Gorguts responded and slammed his claw into the ceiling of the truck, denting it. The clang served to relax his urge a tiny bit, so he did it, again and again. All around the warboss, his orcs began drumming on whatever was in reach in beat with him. Now, this was a propar wah, Gorguts concluded. By the time the war boss could see the fighting, the itch was back in full power. His muscles tensed, ready to snap from a pressure coming from within. Far in the distance, explosions, fire and blood flew in all directions. The Hummies fought. Excellent. Advance, bring us closer, Gorguts roared. The moment he laid eyes on the combat, deep-buried instincts took over. He had to be there, right in the thick of it. His body demanded it, and even as they approached, something within began to change. Ede Hunter began to sweat, and his bloodshot eyes never left the mesmerizing sight of artillery tearing boys to shreds. Go! Drive over them. All around him, the orcs felt the same tension, both in the air and deep within their bodies, and they all surged forward. Divisions' worth of armor drove forward heedless of what was on the way. Boys on foot, bikes, other smaller vehicles, it didn't matter. Anything and everything that stood between them and the fight they drove over or through. Very soon, the faster and more agile bikes and smaller trucks pulled forward and drove through the back lines of the thinning mobs at the head of the horde. It was a time-honored and the often preferred orc strategy. Throw endless bodies at the enemy, and if there were points of tough resistance, throw more at them because there the scrapping be good. More often than not, it tended to work, if for no other reason, because once the enemy at the point of contact ran of heavy weapon ordnance, of said weapons overheated, the orc mobs could swarm them. That was a perfect way for younger, weaker runts to prove themselves and grow if they lived. Gorguts blinked at those thoughts. As he came closer and closer to the fight, his mind began to clear even as the pressure to join the fray and grow constantly intensified without a respite in sight. These thoughts, they weren't proper orky ones, or were they? He used his mega claw to scratch his temple and brush away some sweat and skin alike. If he was the Hummies, he would show his hand soon to deal with the danger of the armor. Where did that come from? Golden light shone all across the sky. Clouds and smoke alike trembled and tore asunder as spears of pure energy slammed into the back of the orc armor formations. Boys and tanks alike ceased to exist within 300 meters of the epicenters of the orbital strikes. 2 kilometers away, heatwave flash burned flesh, searing it away from the bone, and melted all metal it washed over. Beyond that distance, the heat itself gradually ceased to be immediately deadly, at least for those safely buttoned in looted tanks. For them, the shockwave that came on the heels of the heat proved to be a proper can-opener. In one fell sweep, the orbital strikes tore off and devoured the heart of Gorguts' horde. Perhaps he shouldn't have clumped everyone together in such a delicious target, the war boss thought, even as the never-ending roar of the bombardment shook and deafened him. He shook himself, and instincts long forgotten took over. Wah! Gorguts roared, and every orc in the region, no matter if they still had working ears or not, heard and felt him. His very will drove them forward, and even crippled boys, who by no means should have been able to more than crawl, got up on ruined legs, or dragged themselves forward with seared hands that were more charred bones than flesh. He felt better than ever. He was unstoppable. No puny Hummies would bring down the orcs on this day. No blue skins, warp spawn, or the old enemies. He was Gorguts' Ed Hunter. He was boss, and he would triumph. Multiple batteries of concealed basilisk and death strike artillery chose that moment to speak as one, roaring back their defiance in the face of the Wah! Earthshaker rounds threw off the remaining mobs off their feet, fuel-air explosions tore their lungs to shreds before liquid promethium set them all ablaze. The artillery kept coming in constant steel shower, yet the orcs, driven into frenzy by Gorguts' very will and newly awakened instincts, drove right through. The huge machine that drove the war boss tore its way through hills of charred and torn-apart orcs. Thick clouds of spore and smoke cut the visibility to almost nothing. Yet the mech boy driving could sense the enemy nearby and aimed their way. Soon they exited the haze to see multiple proper orky vehicles had made it through the artillery. They were slow, much slower they ought to be, as they grind their way through mountains of corpses. That gave more than enough time for the Hummies to orderly retreat from a third line of trenches to a fourth. When the few remaining boys of the leading mobs swarmed over the abandoned redoubt, concealed charges turned them all into living torches before a second set scythed through them and utterly demolished that line of defense. The orc armor advanced heedless of the losses or their chances of victory. They were orcs, the enemy was right there, in front of them, and that was all that mattered. Something caught Gorguts's eye, and he looked up. Ugly, blocky, almost properly orky shapes dove through the smoke-choked skies. Missiles detached from pods under their wings shot down seeking targets, and nose-mounted energy weapons carved through armor and orcs alike. The warboss glared impotently at the warplanes that were out of reach before he jumped from the slowed-down truck and rushed towards the enemy lines. He had to get to grips with them, nothing else mattered. His instincts sang of war and the growth it heralded, and finally they overtook him fully. Gorguts ran forward shooting at everything that moved, and soon groups of knobs, mostly the mega-armored ones who could survive better near misses, joined him. More and more armor made it through the steel shower, and he could feel the puny Humies faltering. He could almost taste victory here, yet the scratching in his head demanded attention. The warboss jumped over the remains of the last abandoned trench, and unstoppable tide of knobs followed him. The heavy armored boys charged straight in, even as Gorguts himself slowed down. What he saw gave the scratch in his head the opening it needed to tamper his bloodlust. Orderly ranks of human tanks waited for them. They were dug in right behind the next line of trenches. More of them and larger models approached from behind them. He glanced up and saw the Cass plane swinging in for another pass, and if that wasn't enough, 3 falling stars streaked through the air, seemingly straight at him. There was one single thought filling Gorguts's mind at that moment. I should have planned this one better. As if waiting for him to get this realization, the humans opened fire as one and drowned his screaming knobs in an avalanche of coherent light, fire, and high-explosive death. There was nothing to it. They had to break through, get among the humans, or die. Wah! Gorguts screamed his rage, aimed as much at himself as at the humans slaughtering his boys, and activated his tactical teleporter. A flash of unreality and alien cold thoughts followed before he came back into the real world. His return turned a group of humans into cooked chunks of twisted flesh and bone. Before their buddies could respond, they had a furious warboss in between them, and all they could do was die screaming. Chapter 3, Parts 3 and 4. Chapter 3, On Death's Ground. Part 3, Imperial Lines, Pavonian Heartlands. For 2 hours, there was little to do but watch the slaughter. The orc horde threw itself against our lines. Mortars and all kinds of direct-fire heavy weapons, along with whole regiments of infantry, did their best to turn the Xeno into green paste, rinse and repeat. A normal enemy would have broken a long time ago. There were very few known species that could sustain and find the orcs' tactics acceptable. The Tyranids came to mind, a few really nasty xenotypes that were hopefully exterminated during the Great Crusade. The only other thing that could rival this madness was a full-blown chaos invasion, complete with hordes of demons, something we might have to deal with sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, the slaughter wasn't a one-sided affair. While a relatively small portion of the mobs that impaled themselves on our lines were armed with projectile weapons, in absolute numbers there were tens of thousands of them using the other Xenos as live shields. Their accuracy was terrible too. However, if you sent enough bullets downrange, you would eventually hit someone, by sheer luck if nothing else. The exchange rate was ridiculous. Tens of thousands of orcs were gone, with a few hundred injured guardsmen, and the last time I checked, our dead were in the lower double-digit range. Yet the green screaming maniacs kept coming. Soon the guard had to abandon the first line of trenches after mountains of corpses cut their firing lanes to almost nothing, and orcs using their dead as cover came perilously close to reaching the first line of defense. The mortars and heavy weapons went to maximum rate of fire to cover the orderly retreat, and whole regiments pulled back to the second line of trenches and bunkers. We lost a few more people shot in the open by lucky orcs before the retreat was complete, and once a large number of the Xenos swarmed the abandoned position, the charges built in for precisely this purpose detonated. The whole front line lit up in hundreds of simultaneous explosions, and thousands of orcs ceased to exist in a blink of an eye. They kept coming and dying. A smarter enemy would have been wary about us pulling off the same trap when the guard had to abandon the second trench line. The orcs didn't care. They swarmed the abandoned positions and for a second time died by the thousands for no gain. Then a third and a fourth before their armor formations approached. We saw it all in high definition thanks to hundreds of servo skulls spread all over the front, providing intelligence and scanning for stealth units, either unusually cunning orcs or more likely and dangerous Eldar raiding parties. Speaking about those particular Xenos, since dawn they had made themselves scarce, and instead of feeling relief, I waited for the next shoe to drop. "Do we have eyes on the war boss?" I asked while scanning the various sensor feeds. Nearby, Antia stood with closed eyes, and if you didn't know better, you might think he was asleep. Instead, he was scanning the warp for any really unpleasant surprises, like Eldar assassins or demon incursions. Negative. Whatever they're burning for fuel is creating a fume cloud above their armor formation that confuses even the warships' aurspecs. A young captain reported after consulting with our resident Martian, who incidentally handled the communications with the Blood Raven's battle barge in orbit. "The Xeno armor is coming too close. If we have to handle them the hard way, we'll suffer unacceptable losses," I concluded. The colonel nodded in relief. Unfortunately, there were in fact certain Imperial commanders, Inquisitors too, who would be all too eager to get to grips with the enemy and damn the consequences. Those nice folks, especially if they were among the Commissar Corps, would be all too eager to shoot anyone disagreeing as a defeatist. Magos sent my compliments to the captain along with request to remove as much of the Xeno armor as possible without demolishing our own lines. I addressed the senior tech priest attached to the general's staff. He was forwardly deployed today for one reason only, to facilitate communications with the warship in orbit. The Martian answered with a stream of binary that was hopefully a confirmation of my orders, and I returned my attention to the hololith. Once upon a time, the Imperial forces of all branches worked much closely together. Everyone from the lowest of the low privates up to generals, fleet commanders, and Astartes commanders. Then the great heresy happened, and making sure that a turned commander couldn't take with them a large contingent of the Emperor's military became more important than close coordination and unified chain of command. It worked more often than not, though the downside was obvious. It was always paid in lives by the poor bastards on the ground. What I had to order right now, that was a prime example. Even General Alexander didn't have the authority to order orbital strikes, even if the warship in orbit was part of the regular navy instead of a Adeptus Astartes battle barge. At best, he could make it a request, one that the captain wasn't bound to take seriously. It was even worse when tactical orbital strikes were needed by regimental or even battalion-level formations. An order from an Inquisitor, on the other hand, one authenticated from the senior Martian on the ground, that was a different matter. Order received and confirmed. Praise the Omnisire. Orbital bombardment imminent. The Martian spoke in more or less clear High Gothic. It was obvious that the cogboy was gleeful even through his mechanical speech. "Spread the word. Have everyone brace for close-in orbital strikes." My words were redundant. Colonel Barnabas was already busy screaming orders. Servo skulls went to ground. Any tank that wasn't already sealed buttoned up along with any other crewed vehicle, and every soldier not busy pumping shot after shot into the advancing orcs went behind the deepest, sturdiest cover they could find and closed their eyes. It wasn't a moment too soon either. A few of sensor probes were still up, giving us a great view of the orc horde. The dust, smoke, orc spores and whatever else hung above the battlefield, making aerial and orbital surveillance problematic, got stabbed by blinding lances of pure energy thicker than a Lehman Russ. Their very passage cleared the sky for kilometers around, and when they hit, the soil vaporized at the impact, before anything on the edge of the strike turned into plasma. The resulting release of energy blinded the servo skulls, and once the screens cleared, multiple mushroom clouds rose from the heart of the orc horde. The ground below our feet rumbled and shook from the bombardment, and finally the shockwave washed over the bunker, carrying the roar of the explosions. Even at this range, it was almost deafening, endless crescendo. For the poor bastards in the trenches, it had to be pure hell. Bombardment complete. The litany of fury is moving station to better cover the chaos incursion. The Martian reported. He sounded like he had whatever passed for a boner for his cogboy kind. Colonel, I recommend you release all artillery batteries. Concentrate fire on the front leading right at the regiment in front of us. Let's make this the most heavy contested area on the battlefield. I nodded at the librarian at my back. We're going to meet the war boss. If it's still alive, I don't believe it would be able to decline our invitation. The sensor feeds were bloody enough. Yet as we approached the front, I stood on top of the chimera we rode, and I could say one thing for certain. Those images didn't do it justice, no matter how good the cameras were. The whole horizon was gone, replaced by angry pillars of smoke, dust, and raining debris. In fact, everything about 10 kilometers away from the front was one giant, if dying firestorm. The energy discharge and everything it threw in the atmosphere had another side effect too. Black storm clouds formed fast above the bombarded zone. Enemy armor in sight. They're driving right over their own corpses, a Vox operator reported. All units pull back to the last trench line. Artillery support is available at this time. 36th Golgotha Infantry Regiment has priority on fire missions. Be advised, Aeronautica assets will begin danger-close bombing runs against Xeno armor assets. As we approached, concealed tanks came to life along with the chimeras carrying their infantry support. The great majority of them were Lehman Russ variants. However, a Baneblade unit was available as the final reserve and an armored fist to be deployed once we had eyes on the war boss, or the situation went to hell. Even a Bloodraven Predator platoon should be ready on the far flank. I hoped that all of this was an overkill because the bombardment took out the war boss. A few minutes later, I found I wasn't that lucky. Priority target side. Coordinate, Heavy Xeno infantry assaulting grid L23. A huge orc is leading them. That's our target. Colonel Barnabas, Inquisitor Vale. Priority target located. Grid L23. Release the rest of the armor reserve. We're moving to engage as well. The Emperor protects. Too soon, the Chimera brought us around a small tree-covered hill that had snipers and artillery observes crawling all over it, and I saw the orc onslaught with my own eyes. As far as I could see, there were green-armored behemoths, many of them hefting crew-served weapons as if they were toys. They were busy rampaging through the trenches, while guardsmen either shot them as fast as they could press the trigger or fought a losing melee battle. Dug-in tanks raked the orcs with bolters and high-explosive shells, heavy weapon teams shot them with autocannons and lance batteries until their weapons glowed from the heat, bombers screamed above us and shot at everything big and green that moved. Yet the Xeno didn't stop coming. A single blood-splattered and scorched orc towered above that carnage. I saw it grab a screaming commissar with a claw that looked large enough to lift up tanks, and it cut the man in two within a shower of blood. Then the bloody bastard threw the commissar's torso in the air. The poor bastard was still screaming and closed its huge armored jaw around it. Fury and revulsion burned in my chest at that gruesome sight. "This thing needs to die now," I hissed. "Driver, ram that orc. Antes, give us an opening." I felt the warp stir behind me, and the librarian's whole form lit up with eldritch fire. Despite the cacophony of the battle, I could hear Antaeus' deep, soothing voice as he began to chant prayers to the Emperor. Runes and circuits built in his power hammer glowed with golden light. "As you say, sir." The driver sounded less than thrilled. However, apparently he decided that charging a rampaging orc boss was less hazardous to his health than disregarding even a suicidal order from the Inquisition. Smart man. I drew my chainsword and carefully opened my mind-eye to the warp. Prayers and chants meant to focus, my power fell off my lips and sickly sweet energy raced through my veins. My sight sharpened, my heartbeat quickened to unhealthy level, and the world around me began slowing down even as the power within me grew. I pointed my sword at the war boss, and purple lighting danced over its adamantite-tipped teeth. The chimera below us roared as the driver put it into high gear, and we charged the green monstrosity. Part 4. Imperial Lines, Pavonian Heartlands. I perceived the world in a slow motion through warp-enhanced senses. The air stank. The unfathomable stench of ozone from energy discharges, burned orcs, fear, human blood and other fluids assaulted my nose. I could see men and women fight, scream curses and prayers to the Emperor, and die as the advancing orc knobs slammed into our lines. A group of heavy armored monsters jumped above a trench and tore everyone apart with wicked claws, only to lose their legs as the fortification blew up as a final fuck you from the guardsmen. A dug-in tank shot one of the crippled orcs in the face with a he-round that blew up its torso in a shower of fire and gore. More knobs surged forward, and the armored leading elements of the armored reserve arrived just in time to meet them with bolter and cannon. A flight of bombers roared above us as they came in to strafe the piles of scrap the Xeno called armor. Our driver shouted fervent prayers as he pointed the Chimera straight at the blood-splattered warboss and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The APC buckled and charged straight at the massive monster. Time was up. I roared an incantation and waved my sword in an arc, thus sending purple lighting at the warboss's head. I more felt than saw Antaeus vault over me and hurl himself at the green behemoth propelled by his transhuman biology, power armor, and psychic power. My lighting struck the perturbing metal jaw of the orc with a blinding flash a moment before the Chimera slammed into his chest. I jumped away, trusting my armor and eldritch power, strengthening my flesh to survive. Torn ground, mud and blood in my mouth and pain. The world swam in front of my eyes, yet I got up on my feet due to my will alone. The warboss was still right here, holding the Chimera and crushing it. The world suddenly sped up, and the deafening sound of the battle crashed over me in full. There was no sight of Antaeus, however. When the orc threw the mangled APC aside, I could see his face clearly. Its left side, along with the metal jaw on that side, was simply gone. Scorched flesh and bone stared me in a grotesque parody of sneer. I saw something blinking below the orc, then Antaeus was upon the monster, swinging his weapon in golden arc. The warboss parried with glowing power claws and leveled his hand cannon at the librarian. Only then did my mind fully kick back into gear, and I charged at the orc without thinking things through. I spat an incantation, and arcs of burning warp ran down my arm until they surrounded my hungry chainsword. I pointed it at the orc and unleashed the attack at his cannon. Eldritch lighting slammed into the weapon and threw the metal, eating through it with ease. The cannon's barrels twisted and blew up when the warboss tried to shoot Antaeus. The warp shook and twisted as something passed right through it. The aftershock shook me to the core, and it was only the Emperor's mercy that I didn't lose control of the powers running through me and blew off my head, or worse. Multicolored lighting surrounded us, tasting blue. The air cracked and screamed in torment, and I found myself on my arse, staring dumbly at 4 towering titans painted red. The Terminators, for they could be nothing less, wasted no time and charged at the orc with inhuman speed. To the Xeno's credit, the assault didn't deter it. It actually laughed so loud that his guttural joy drowned the war around us. I saw his muscles bulge as warp energy seeped into them. With a shove, he sent Antaeus stumbling back, and in the same motion backhanded a space marine sprinting at it with hammer and shield. The Terminator took the blow on his shield, lighting cracked, and the Angel of Death flew back from the impact. A second Terminator clashed with the ruined cannon. His power ace bit deep into it, yet even as weakened as it was, the Astartes weapon couldn't properly cut through it with a single strike. The other 2 Space Marines were more successful. One lit the orc's back on fire with a huge flamer, while the other slammed a lighting claw into the back of its right knee. The warboss howled as his leg gave away before power claws tore into the bulky junk covering its back. Antaeus had recovered and was upon the beast again, even as the axe-wielding Terminator kept pushing down, pinning its left arm. It raised its huge claws to strike that never landed. The last Terminator didn't even bother coming closer again. Instead, he threw his hammer at the orc's elbow, and the strike made his claw fly harmlessly above the librarian's head. The warboss flinched away from the incoming power hammer in the last moment, and instead of pulping its head for good, the force weapon slammed into its right shoulder, crushing flesh and metal alike. The beast's burning and slicked backpack discharged arching electricity and raw warp power for a split second. That was all the warning the Space Marines got. They moved as one, stepping back just in time. Reality twisted and screamed in agony. The warboss twisted with it, and then it was gone. For a few long moments, the only sounds over the battlefield was roar of barking Imperial weaponry. Hundreds, if not thousands of orcs stared at the space where their warboss used to be. Wow! The armored beasts roared as one and charged at us, yet some of the smaller ones that had survived up until now slowed down, and here and there, a few of them broke and ran. I shook my head, trying to process what just happened before my training kicked in, despite the concussion I likely suffered. I grit my bloody teeth and forced my power to cooperate. Scalding warp energy bubbled in my veins as I got up. It was just in time, too, because a group of knobs was busy butchering a fire team in the trench beside me, and I was their next target. Long lines of heavy bolter shells flew past me and stitched through the knobs. The Terminators fanned out in pairs and jumped in the fray, while Antaeus raised his power hammer and warp fire surrounded its head. He jumped in a way that should have been impossible in his armor, and even my warp-enhanced sight had trouble following him. One moment he stood where the orc vanished, a blur, and then he was at the trench beside me. His hammer slammed into a knob, towering a head above the librarian, and fire exploded from the impact, burning the beast to ash. A fiery corona flew in a semicircle in front of Antaeus, lighting up everything on fire. I sent my own warp powers into the fray by launching a lighting bolt at a knob that disregarded the fact it was burning and charged the librarian screaming obscenities. My attack cracked its armor and staggered him, momentarily pausing its advance. The knob never had a chance to resume its advance. What looked like a bright white laser beam turned it into flying bloody chunks. I dared glance over my shoulder and grinned like a maniac. The armor reserve was finally in place, unleashing the Emperor's own wrath upon the Xeno. For the Emperor, no mercy! I screamed, waving my sword like a madman, and charged into the fray. Chapter 3, Parts 5006. Chapter 3, On Death's Ground, Part 5, Imperial Lines, Pavonian Heartlands. In a hindsight, charging the orc knobs right beside the Emperor's own Adeptus Astartes, when I only had a carapace armor for protection and a chainsword as a weapon, wasn't my brightest idea. I reached that profound revelation after the teeth of my blade got stuck in the spine of a huge Xeno, who nevertheless managed to backhand me, tearing my cheek and cracking teeth. I suddenly found myself on the ground with aforementioned orc, dragging himself my way on legs that no longer worked. The greenskin roared at me, displaying an impressive array of a very large teeth. A huge blocky shape chose that moment to fly overhead and strafe the whole area with all kinds of weapons, which it seemed were stuck on every surface of the bomber. Streams of heavy bolter fire, lance cannons and missiles splashed over the knobs and, more importantly, tore the brute coming my way to great many bloody chunks that rained all over me. A small voice in the back of my head shook in terror, wondering the fuck was I doing out here. While the rest of me got into gear and I went to see if my sword had survived the aerial attack. Say what you will about the training I got in the Scholar and later the Inquisition-sponsored academy, it ensured I didn't freeze up even when my courage was doing its best to fail. Another knob came my way. This one was armored from head to toe and carried an odd mix between an axe and warhammer, taller than me and likely heavier. When it saw me, the orc roared a challenge and ran at me, raising the weapon for overhead strike. My heart did its best to jump out of my chest, even as I clawed at my connection with the Immaterium and drew as much power as I could. The orc was almost at me when I spread my arms and unleashed the energy at the towering brute. Purple lighting flashed between my hands and flew outwards in a condensed arc. The flash was intense enough that it blinded me, and the next thing I knew, something struck my left shoulder with enough strength to bring me to my knee. The pain that hit next was almost an afterthought. The geyser of blood spraying from my mangled shoulder where the orc's axe had struck was something else too. At least the bastard was dead. He was on his knees and missed both his arms below the elbow as well as his head above the chin. I had to be in shock. That explained why I wasn't screaming my lungs out. And I was still bleeding. Perhaps I should be doing something about it while I still could. Emperor, have mercy, I muttered, and drew more power from the Immaterium. My brain protested, and I felt a trickle of blood leaking from my nose, but ignored it. Lighting cracked around the fingers of my right hand, and I pressed it at the gushing wound. All I knew then was pain, and I was sure I screamed louder than the fucking orcs. Thankfully, I lasted long enough to cauterize my wound and more or less release the warp in a controlled manner before blacking out. A swing from his power weapon turned the head of a particularly ugly orc into mush. Antaeus didn't bother to pull out his hammer out of the Xeno's torso before channeling energy into it and unleashing a blast wave that blew the alien into chunks before slamming into a group of its friends and threw them off their feet. That maneuver bought him enough time to draw more power from the warp, and just as the other 3 orcs got up, he let it go at the middle one. The knob had one moment to see death coming before the librarian's attack hit and blew up its torso as if it had swallowed a grenade. The explosion was potent enough to mangle the other 2 knobs, and before they could recover, Antaeus was at them. He smashed aside the crude axe the closer one carried, breaking its arm in the process, then reversed the direction of his swing and tore off the lower jaw of the Xeno. Despite the battle going around, the Space Marine could clearly hear the orc's neck crack from the strike. He nevertheless slammed his power hammer in the side of the knob's head, shattering its skull. That gave him just enough time to turn around and meet the attack of the last Xeno who had recovered from the explosion. At least as much as it could, with its left arm mangled enough to show bone on multiple places. That didn't stop it from screaming its defiance of all that was holy and wildly swing its sword with its other hand. Antaeus parried a crude slash, took a step back and poked the orc's torso with his power hammer channeling energy from the immaterium into the weapon all the while. The warp energy released on contact, further enhancing the power of the strike. The orc's crude armor caved in, and the librarian heard the satisfying sound of shattering ribs. Not that such an injury was enough to put down the maddened orc. It brushed the hammer aside with its mangled hand, all the while screaming in pain and fury, not to mention throwing blood everywhere along with thick spit, and did its best to skewer Antaeus. The Space Marine sidestepped the thrust, took a step forward, and headbutted the Xeno before pushing it away with the hilt of his warhammer. That was enough to slow down the wounded orc, and before it could manage another credible attack, the librarian struck true. The head of his warhammer caught the knob in the side, just below the shoulder, and caved in armor, flesh and bone alike, before tearing its way clear through the chest and throwing the orc away. With the enemy crippled and down for the time being, Antaeus looked around for more immediate threats. What he saw filled him with pride. What few orcs were still on their legs were busy engaging his brothers with the rest, trying to run around as the guard-armored reserve scythed them down. That was good. With the orc boss gone, hopefully for good, and his knobs, the largest and strongest in the horde, along with most of said horde, dead, the orc threat on the planet should be contained for the time being. While the orcs were far from gone, much less for good, after this defeat, they would be of no consequence until the Imperial forces could deal with the other, more pressing threats. Antaeus finished the crippled orc, and by the time that was done, the last few remaining enemies found themselves surrounded by the Terminators, who made a short work of the despicable Xenos. "We did the Emperor's work today, brothers," Antaeus proclaimed. "You did well, Inquisitor." The librarian paused. Where was the Inquisitor? He looked around, and it didn't take him long to find the man's crumpled form. "We need a medic at my location, ASAP. The Inquisitor is down." Part 6. Guardfield Medical Station, Pavonian Heartlands. Pain and thunder. That was the first thing I became aware of. Searing agony exploded in my right shoulder and the side of my head, especially my jaw. It was more than enough to jolt me awake, and I tried to get up as disoriented as I was. "He's awake," a blurred figure shouted. I noticed. Another one added with dry sarcasm. "Hold him down and add more painkillers." A second blur leaned above me and soon became a face obscured by surgical mask. "Inquisitor, hold on, you're in a bad shape. Try not to move while we take care of you." More thunder. What I was laying on shook along with the blurred figures who cursed and had to hold on me to remain standing. Dust came from the ceiling, and the second blur cursed colorfully. "Clean it up now. The last thing he needs is an infection." I tried to speak only to find out that I had an oxygen mask on my face. "The Xeno are coming closer. We need to evacuate the wounded now," a new voice shouted from somewhere to the left. "We're in the middle, multiple operations here. We need more time or our patients will die." The second blur snapped. "Can't be helped. We don't have enough troops in the area to hold this position. The general ordered general retreat to secondary defense lines. Get all who might be able to walk stimulant shots. We'll carry the rest and give the Emperor's mercy to anyone who won't survive being moved. By the sound of it, the soldier wasn't pleased by the orders. Nor was I, for that matter, when it dawned to me that I might be one of those to receive the Emperor's mercy. It's either that or abandoning them to the Xeno. Damn aliens! The second blur looked back at me. I'm sorry, Inquisitor. Your arm is going to be a write-off under these circumstances. Amputate, seal the wound, and we'll fill him up with painkillers and stimulants. I don't want to explain how we lost the Inquisitor to the General or higher authority. I'm sorry about this, lad. He added. Then I saw another masked figure brandish an injector. Then the world blurred for a time and I could no longer focus. At least the pain subdued as I drifted on a wave of chemicals, or so I presumed before I felt another pinprick. Moments later, something cold raced through my veins and the world sharply came into focus. With it came more thunder and shaking, artillery or airstrikes coming too close to comfort, my mind supplied. Inquisitor, can you hear me? We need to leave now. A man in a surgical mask and blood-splattered scrubs shouted at me. Sit, Rep, I managed to rasp through raw throat and parched lips. The Tau are about to overrun this position. We need to pull back now. The fuck? Without wasting any more time, the doctor, or at least I presumed he was a doctor, grabbed me by the right shoulder and helped me sit up, something that momentarily made the world spin before coming back into focus. He slung my still not really responding right arm over his own shoulder and dragged me towards the exit. Only then did I notice that there were more blood and dusts, splattered soldiers and medics doing their best to get the wounded moving. Contested territory, Pavonian heartlands. The Baneblade's armor rang as a gong when a pair of railgun slugs glanced off the sloped, thick frontal armor. More vampires, 10 o'clock, the Auspex operator screamed in his vox, nearly deafening the tank's crew. Air support is fully engaged. The young lieutenant added more quietly. The Hydras will have to take care of them. Captain Garrick, the commander of the super-heavy tank, whispered to himself. Tau heavy in sight, the gunner announced. Reload complete, firing. The Baneblade shook as its main cannon thundered, shaking the whole vehicle and rattling the crew, despite all of them being securely strapped in their seats. Scratch one hover tank. Through cameras and Auspex feeds, the captain could see that the sergeant was right. He in fact saw the AT round slice through the side of a large Tau hover tank, which jolted back from the sheer strength of the kinetic impact before blowing up and crashing on top of a group of charging Kroot. Driver, keep pulling back. The infantry should have reformed their lines by now and try not to run over any of the crunchies. They get peeved off when it happens. The captain ordered and returned his full attention on the situation at hand, which was foobarred by the numbers. Just 15 minutes after the guard broke the Orc horde, the Tau decided it was a splendid time to attack and threw all their mobile forces at the already weakened Imperial flank. The infantry lines that the aliens struck got overrun within 30 minutes, though their sacrifice bought the rest of the regiments in the sector time to react. For Garrick and his command, that meant a counterattack to blunt the enemy advance and buy enough time for the infantry to consolidate, move to better positions and reform their lines. At the same time, the artillery regiments had to pull back farther to avoid being plastered by enemy long-range firepower and rearm before responding in kind. The only silver lining was that for once, the Blood Ravens decided to be helpful and dropped what little reserves they had on their battle barge. Even now, Tactical and Devastator squads were skirmishing with the enemy providing infantry support, while Devastators were digging in along with the Guard. For all the good it was going to do. Stormguard actual to all Stormguard elements, sound off and confirm ammo status. The colonel in charge of Garrick's regiment demanded, Storm Angel actual to Stormguard actual, combat status nominal, ammo at 46% and counting. The captain responded, Maish, tank, 1 o'clock, kill it. APCs on the open, 2 o'clock. Targets designated, the Baneblade's cupola turned right to aim at the Tau armored unit, while secondary batteries opened fire at the Tau transports. Heavy bolters, autocannons, and lance cannons sent a storm of steel and coherent light, which opened the APCs like tin cans, and turned their troop compartments into abattoirs. The enemy tank shot at the retreating Baneblade, and its railgun tore through a heavy bolter before tearing a shallow rend in the armor. The main cannon spoke again, and this time it was certainly an overkill. Garrick saw the shell slice through the target lengthwise before clipping an unlucky enemy walker that jumped down at the wrong time and place. The tank blew up a moment later, obscuring what happened to the walker after its shoulder ceased to exist. An alarm sounded into the tank's command center. "Brace for impact. Enemy bombers incoming," the captain snapped. "Keep driving back." The Baneblade's close-in defense weapons locked in the enemy's trajectory and filled the air with as many shells as they could. A surviving Hydra added its fury to the onslaught and managed to clip the wings of the rightmost bomber. The Xenopilot lost control, and its abominable ship crashed into the ravaged farmland, vanishing in a blue-tinted explosion. The remaining bombers flew straight in the teeth of the Baneblade's defenses. At this close range, even the best ECM in the world was useless, and the enemy had no trouble targeting the super-heavy unit. Missiles detached from under the bomber's wings and streaked towards the retreating Baneblade before the pilots opened fire with short-range plasma weapons and heavy railguns. The Hydra racked a second Tau flyer with heap shells and tore its belly open before detonating an engine, but by then it was far too late. The Baneblade shook as railguns tore chunks of its armor and disabled weapons. Then the plasma hit, boiling armor and frying everything in the vicinity of the hit. In one fell swoop, the super-heavy tank lost a third of its secondary weaponry along with its right track. Then it was the missiles' turn. Close-in fire and various anti-missile systems did their best. A couple of the weapons were blinded in the last possible moment and barely missed the tank as it suddenly jolted and changed direction due to the lost track. 4 more failed to survive the last-ditch defense fire. That still left 6 missiles to strike the Baneblade. 3 slammed in its front right. Their plasma warheads vaporized armor and tore the right front wheels of the tank, significantly diminishing its mobility. Another one struck to the right, beside the turret where a secondary weapon emplacement used to be. Plasma boiled away yet more armor before breaching into the interior compartments and flooding a few of them with the fury of starfire. 3 members of the crew died 10 and there, burned on their stations, which became their own personal crematoriums. The remaining 2 missiles struck on the top of the turret in a quick succession. The first seared away any surviving equipment there and turned the well-protected commander's compartment into sauna. The second sliced into the weakened armor and on detonation vaporized Captain Garrick. Despite countermeasures, the heat in the nearby compartments spiked beyond human tolerance, forcing the gunner and Vox operators to black out from sheer thermal shock. Any other tank in the Imperial arsenal would have died then and there. A Baneblade was built to survive this kind of punishment, and more, then keep on going. Its enraged machine spirit broke through the soothing chants of the countless sanctified servo skulls, meant to keep it more or less docile and protect it from chaos corruption, to assert full control of its wounded body. It used the engine to roar its displeasure and fury before swinging around the damaged turret to target an approaching Tau super-heavy unit that desired to finish it out. Before the alien machine could target the Baneblade and fire, the machine spirit fired and its shot flew true. The front half of the enemy unit crumpled as if stepped on by a titan before the rest of it sympathetically blew up as ammunition and fuel cells detonated. Heedless of the tactical situation and lost in its fury, the wounded Baneblade charged the enemy. Caring not, it dragged its damaged mechanical carcass against impossible odds. Behind it, the last Tau bomber got jumped by an Imperial air superiority fighter that splashed it in short order before it could attempt a second attack run. Chapter 3. Parts 7 and 8. Chapter 3. On Death's Ground. Part 7. Imperial Lines. Pavonian Heartland's railgun slugs tore through the air overhead with piercing cracks. Plasma immolated the top of a small hill that provided the medical station with a bit of a cover. Imperial and Tau fighters and bombers dueled in the sky above, even as artillery thundered in the distance, sending shrieking shells in all directions. As if that wasn't enough, callous and hungry alien laughter came from just out of sight. "We will hold the Xeno here." A commissar wearing the typical red hat and long coat of his station waved his chainsword and pointed it at the still-burning top of the hill. "Take position at the ridge," he ordered and led by example. You heard him. Up and at them. Corporal Janna Hailstrom barked at her squad, the last flimsy line of defense between the evacuating wounded and the fast-approaching alien hordes. She had to scream to be heard over the constant cracks of alien railguns and thunder of artillery. Without wasting any time, her squad surged to their feet and ran after the commissar. Before any of the humans could reach the ridge, an alien crest appeared over the top, followed by a pair of reptilian eyes and razor-sharp beak. The commissar reacted before any of the guardsmen could, raised his las pistol and shot the Xeno in the eye. A beam of coherent light vaporized the alien's eyeball, drilled its way into its skull, and boiled away the alien's brain. "Go, go, go," the corporal shouted, pushing her men to move faster. However, even as the Imperials ran up the slope, a large number of Kroot swarmed over the top of the hill and charged downhill. The commissar shot a second Xeno in the head before its buddies reached him. The Imperial revved up his chainsword and cleaved through a wicked-looking staff an alien tried to brain him with. The commissar proceeded to shoot a Kroot running at him in the throat, and before that foul Xeno could fall to the ground, he gutted his first attacker with a deft strike. All the while, he didn't stop taunting and cursing the Kroot. The guardsmen entered the fray then, pausing their run uphill. They took care not to shoot the commissar and instead did their best to prevent the aliens from successfully swarming him. Laser guns blasted away chunks or even appendages from Kroot who had skimmed on armor, while others could survive a few hits before their protection gave away. For a moment, it appeared that the guardsmen would prevail due to superior ranged firepower. Yet in the end, there were too many of the Xenos, and a number of them were too large and well armored to bring down in time, so the illusion of victory didn't last. A large Kroot took advantage of the commissar eviscerating one of its packmates to stab the Imperial in the thigh with the barbed head of its staff. The alien viciously twisted and pulled his weapon, and its efforts were rewarded by the staff tearing out a bloody chunk of the human's leg. The commissar went down screaming, and the Xenos swarmed over him. Despite that, he managed to tear out the lungs of a Kroot before the rest began tearing him to pieces. Meanwhile, the guard squad kept on pouring firepower in the Xeno, bringing more and more of them down. Unfortunately for them, a second pack made its way over the crest. "Grenades," the corporal ordered. For a moment the shooting became ragged as her people grabbed said weapons from their combat rigs and threw them at the Kroot who were just above done with the commissar. The frag grenades detonated in a shower of gore and shrapnel, wiping out the survivors of the first pack. The second one, however, turned out to be more cunning and better armed. They leveled their staffs downhill and opened fire with built-in slug throwers. Something heavy hit the corporal in the gut, tearing through her flak vest, and she suddenly found herself on her knees, trying to get her breath back. She saw one of her men hit the ground like a sack, a bloody gaping hole where his face used to be. The foul alien barking was coming closer and closer, and she could no longer hear laser guns firing. Hailstorm muttered a prayer to the Emperor, and her bloody fingers left her gut, going for the few grenades she had left. She just managed to remove their safeties when something struck her head and she saw stars before everything going dark. An explosion marked the death of the last line of defense between the med center and the enemy raiders. Guardfield Medical Station, Pavonian Heartlands. The doctor managed to drag me out of the med center just in time for whatever defense line the guard covering it to collapse. A short series of sharp explosions came from behind, followed by pained and furious howls that couldn't have come from human throats. "Move! Get the wounded away! Now!" The doctor, keeping me steady, screamed. Some of the soldiers helping their buddies put them down and went for their weapons. A nearby chimera turned in place and headed towards the hill to the right, and the multi-laser on its top opened fire, sending blinding flashes of coherent light overhead. "Incoming!" A nearby trooper shouted, shouldered her weapon, and opened fire. A Xeno screamed in pain. The doctor's efforts to get me to safety became more frantic, and we all ran out of time. More aliens let out battle cries, and a whole pack of Kroot fell upon us. I hissed in eye-searing pain as I drew on the warp, and this time it began to claw at my sanity. I could feel demons taking a notice and looking for the slightest opening, yet I didn't have much of a choice. Despite the Chimera scything down as many of the Xenos as possible and the sporadic resistance from the walking wounded, there were too many of the Kroot. They simply absorbed the casualties and slammed into the makeshift convoy assembling at the entrance of the medical station. An alien jumped from the hill on top of the med station and then sprang into action, razor-sharp staff in hand. It landed nimbly and slammed its weapon in the back of a guardsman trying to get a buddy to the nearby waiting Chimera. Both of them went down, and the Kroot kicked the wounded soldier before bringing down his weapon on his skull, shattering it. The Xeno's triumph was short-lived. A livid cogboy raced out of the med station, brandishing scalpels and saws at the end of each of their 8 mechatendrils, a short sword in one metal arm and a plasma pistol in the other. The Kroot didn't have time to figure out what hit it before literally exploding in a shower of flashing blades and flying organs. Another alien tried to jump the cogboy from the top of the building, only to be met by swinging mechatendrils that eviscerated him in mid-air. When it landed moments later, it was in a lot of pieces. More Kroot came around the medical center and tore through the few soldiers, making a stand to the right. The last guardsman barely managed to activate a grenade before 4 Xeno slashed him with their staffs, and a moment later the frag detonated, tearing them all to bloody chunks. Yet the rest of the pack was undeterred. If anything, the casualties merely made them more bloodthirsty. What followed was a bloody nightmare of a close-quarters combat. I could remember frying Kroot with warp blasts even as demons tried to possess me, the doctor who dragged me out smashing the skull of a Xeno with the butt of a rifle, the cogboy becoming a blood-splattered whirlwind of spinning blades as he tore into the enemy, a large group of the bastards swarming the Chimera opposing them. Then there was thunder that shook me to the bone, and something large and burning came over the hill before twin lines of tracers pulped everything in their way. A landspeeder flew overhead, and a huge red form jumped out, landing on and crushing a particularly large and ugly Kroot. The Space Marine cut another one with a contemptuous slash of his chainsword and shot 3 more before anyone could process his arrival. I was vaguely aware that there were more large shapes coming over the top of the hill, Lehman Russ tanks, I thought. Their cannons roared as one, and the shock from the following explosions was more than enough to throw me off my feet. The last thing I managed to do was let go of the warp in more or less controlled fashion. I heard demons screaming in frustration as my soul slipped through their claws and then knew no more. Part 8. Imperial Lines, Pavonian Heartlands. Purge the abominable Xeno from the face of this world, brothers, Antaeus thundered, while his temper was fraying. They already lost one Inquisitor and his retinue on this cursed planet. He wasn't looking forward to explaining to the Inquisition how they managed to lose a second one in a short order. Said organization already looked at the Blood Ravens with more than enough unwarranted suspicion. Thank you very much. Besides, miracle of miracles, this one was actually rather sane and uncommonly reasonable, so far anyway. Having him die would be such a waste, and allowing the damn Tau of all things get him, that would be simply embarrassing, the librarian grumbled to himself in the privacy of his mind. He emptied the magazine of his bolter pistol at a cluster of charging Kroot, the ammunition making a delightful mess of their heads, and put the weapon back to its magnetic clamp. He raised an open hand just in time to meet a large roaring specimen with a blast of warp fire to the face. The Xeno collapsed, clutching its melting flesh and bone, kicking uselessly in the dirt, while Antaeus moved on to the next threat. Around him, tactical Marines spread out, covering the flanks and keeping annoying pests from a Devastator squad, which set up on the ridge. A platoon of guard armor followed the swifter Astartes, aiding their firepower to the onslaught. And just like that, the Xeno assault broke in a showers of gore and explosions. "Push them back, don't let them regroup," Antaeus shouted aloud, both to his brothers and the soldiers who had to fight the enemy practically hand to hand when the Xeno swarmed them. He saw a familiar and sad picture as he approached the medical station. There were too many dead and dying people on the blood-soaked ground. The sight never failed to put a bitter taste in his mouth. This was what the Blood Ravens fought to prevent. This was why they hoarded all the technology and knowledge they could get their hands on. So one day normal men and women won't have to face the horrors of the galaxy with such ordinary equipment. The sad truth was that generally the guards' equipment wasn't bad. It was just that you needed more in order to face most of the humanity's enemy on equal footing and win without paying with rivers of blood, and even then, there were foes that even the Astartes couldn't best without paying a steep price. Antaeus put aside those thoughts and returned his full attention to the skirmish at hand. Well, its aftermath. The few Kroots still in sight were on the run, with his brothers and especially the guard shooting them in the backs with a relish. Only a handful managed to make it over the nearby hills. It was a target-rich environment after all. Only for a couple of rust tanks to lob a few cells after the aliens. With the immediate threat neutralized, Antaeus could put his full attention into locating the Inquisitor and making sure he lived to fight another day. He soon found his target, surrounded by a small group of shell-shocked troopers, most of them wounded, a very happy cogboy, who was splattered in Kroot blood from the tip of their hood to the toes of the boots, poking out from the hem of their gore-soaked robe, and disgruntled doctor. The Inquisitor was on the ground and looked even worse to wear. The reason why was obvious, not just the Kroot attack, but a number of Xenos dispatched by warp sorcery among the corpses surrounding this particular last stand. Medici, report. What is the status of the Inquisitor? What do you need to keep him alive, and what aid do your other patients require? Antaeus demanded answers. While what was left of the forward positions could not be held with the available assets, an orderly retreat bleeding the alien bastards was very much in the cards, now that their treacherous sneak attack was more or less contained. Transports, medics, drugs, the Emperor's blessing, some of those poor bastards are going to need it all. The doctor grumbled. I'll arrange as much assistance as practical, Antaeus said, and switched comm channels to contact command. What's his condition? The Inquisitor should live if we can keep him from becoming eaten, blown up, or receiving any more blows upon the head. The Martian responded. He'll need some Omnissiah blessed spare parts, so we'll be able to make a proper person out of him. Captain Thule, brother librarian Antaeus, we've located the package. He's still viable, but need extraction, medical attention. Antaeus gave Vale one good look. And some spare parts. Good, get him back to the capital. We're redeploying the bulk of our forces there for the time being, including apothecary assets. Affirmative, sir. We'll need transports and medics to evacuate the wounded before completing the tactical retreat. Apothecary, Victory Bay, Kronus, streams of binary, sterile smell, comfortable bed, and the absence of pain. Somehow, those things didn't tell me that I've merely had a particularly nasty nightmare. The cogboy speech intensified when they noticed me stirring. I cracked my eyes open to see a couple of blurs nearby. One was reddish-brown, as expected. However, the other one was much larger and gayish in color. Inquisitor, you're awake. Good. A deep, jolly voice boomed with enough strength to make my bones rattle. I'm pleased to report that the operation was successful, and you'll have all your new bits and pieces operational in a short order. What? I blinked at the giant figure, trying to process what it just told me. My brain wasn't working quite right, probably all the drugs, which sounded both wrong and right for some reason. What? I asked, though what came out was a strangled croak. My throat was parched too, something that I just noticed. A mechatendril shoved a bottle of water complete with attached straw right into my face, and I took an experimental sip, wondering why was I getting the VIP treatment. What happened? I tried again. My voice sounded weak, tired, and alien to my ears. You charged an Orc warboss, if the rumors are right, riding a chimera no less. The red blur cleared up somewhat, revealing the hooded face of a tech priest, who had at least his chin still made of good old-fashioned flesh and blood. We've got helmet video of that stunt. It was one of the funnier things I've seen people do and live through. The deep, thundering voice commented, that wasn't such a good idea in hindsight. I managed to croak. My memories were coming back now, and I had some trouble believing what I had done. Charging an Orc, a warboss no less. Did I leave my brain, or at least common sense, back in orbit? Well, it worked, kind of. The large blur, which had to be an Astartes, said in something that might have been supposed to be a soothing tone. We don't have a confirmation that said Orc is very dead. The cogboy waved a couple of spiky tentacles behind his back. We're getting off topic. Inquisitor, I'm proud to announce that we managed to install all your new bits and pieces without an issue. You're now truly blessed by the Holy Cog and the Motive Force." He shoved his hand in my face, displaying 5 thin and long metal fingers, which gave me a thumbs up. "What bits and pieces?" I asked warily. Nothing hurt, which meant it couldn't be that bad. Then again, I was dumb enough to charge an orc warboss. That was what Ogryns did. "Left arm, the shoulder, some reinforcements so you could properly use your brand new bionics." The cogboy began listing off on fingers tipped with very sharp-looking points. Those were a lot of bionics he was telling me about. What in the Emperor's name did I do? My brain dragged out fragmented images of screaming orcs, explosions, blood and croûte of all things. I thought I heard an echo of laughter too. But then again, I was probably high up on drugs. Otherwise, I wouldn't be this calm under the circumstances, right?